Hello, this is the 1950T 8P Euro Unit 5A test review for the test on the French Revolution, the Unit 5A test. If you've got the answers to all these questions, you should do great on that test, and I'm going to go down these questions one by one, discuss each one, we'll make it quick, and then you will be ready to go. So the first question is, what was the Ancien Regime? And this was the French term for the system of hierarchy and privilege that determined your status in society if you lived in France in the 18th century. It was ancient, it was traditional, and it impacted every aspect of your life. What were the three estates? Everyone in French society could be categorized as belonging to one of these three estates. You had the first estate, the clergy. You had the second estate, that was the nobility, and you had the third estate, and the third estate was everybody who was not clergy or nobility. Ordinary people, somewhere between 95 and 97% of the total population. And the first and second estates were entitled to all kinds of privileges that were denied to the third estate. And the most important of these privileges was that they were exempt from all taxes. Only the third estate paid any taxes, and this third estate was massively underrepresented in the governmental structure. So if you are in the first and second estates, you live off of the labor of the third estate. You make all the decisions about how to run the country, and you are living tax-free. So where do the bourgeoisie fit into the three estates? 80% of the third estate was rural peasants and urban wage workers. But you also had this emerging middle class of people in the third estate called the bourgeoisie. These were professionals, they're educated, they're skilled, many of them are quite wealthy, many work as officials in the government. They represent a new kind of hierarchy to compete with the old regime wealth. But in spite of their wealth and their status, the bourgeoisie are still ordinary people. They're not clergy, they're not nobility, and they still pay lots of taxes, and they still have just about no representation. So how long are a wealthy and accomplished class of people like the bourgeoisie going to put up with that? That's the question. And so the next question here is, what impact did the American Revolution have on the country of France? And keep in mind that France had helped the colonies win the American Revolution at great financial expense. France gave the colonies way more help than we typically are aware of. And since they weren't taxing the first and second estates, this financial burden pushed them to the point of bankruptcy and insolvency. So this assembly of notables, as you know, there were numerous representative bodies in this story, and the first one of note is this assembly of notables. Why did it meet, and what resulted from its meeting? This was the first national representative body to really meet in France in a long time, and it didn't last long. It was a secret that France couldn't pay its debts. And the finance minister called 144 selected representatives of the clergy and nobility, and actually 2 third estate merchants, to discuss tax reform. And in this scenario, tax reform meant that you actually had to start paying some. Not only did they refuse to start paying taxes, but France's financial woes became public knowledge, and this led to the calling of the Estates General for the first time in 175 years. And so the next question is, what is the primary reason that King Louis XVI was forced to call the Estates General into session for the first time in 175 years? Well, the Estates General had been the representative body that traditionally would run France alongside the king, until Louis's ancestors had decided that they didn't need it anymore. And he called this body together, and it was a major concession for King Louis XVI. He was asking France what France thought should be done about this crisis, since the Assembly of Notables had accomplished nothing except for letting the cat out of the bag about the fiscal crisis that France was going through. So Louis XVI was in effect saying, I can't solve it, you solve it. So we've got this thing about these grievance lists, and what did these grievance lists call for? And so these were lists that were drawn by people in France for the Estates General to take to Paris in the form of their representatives and address. And there were all kinds of grievances on these lists, but the most frequent complaints were about serious food shortages and food prices, complaints about noble privilege, complaints about church wealth, and complaints about unequal taxes. The next question is, what was the calling of the Estates General an opportunity for the Third Estate to actually do? And so the Estates General consisted of three bodies in one, each one of those bodies representing one of the three estates. And the representatives of the Third Estate saw the calling of the Estates General as an opportunity, first and foremost, to reform the tax structure and shift some of that burden to the first two estates, the First Estate and the Second Estate. And this was the only way out of that crisis. The wealthiest 3% of the country weren't paying anything in taxes. However, in order to effect change, the voting procedures of the Estates General needed to change dramatically. The traditional voting procedure was for each of the three estates to get one vote. And this meant that nothing was going to change because any reforms that the Third Estate tried to make would be outvoted 2-1. So the Third Estate representatives refused to go along with that system, and they refused to go into their own Third Estate chamber and set up their roster, and we talked about that whole story. So the next question is, what did the Third Estate representatives change their name to, and what did they do? After about 6 weeks of deadlock, the Third Estate representatives announced that they were now called the National Assembly. They weren't called the Third Estate anymore. They, not the Estates General, now represented the nation. That was their claim. And they claimed that they would now assume the responsibility for the national debt, and they would make whatever reforms were necessary for paying that debt. And they took an oath to each other, the tennis court oath, to continue to meet until a new French constitution could be created, which would reflect these new realities. The king, of course, refused to acknowledge this new National Assembly, but the standoff was broken and the king was forced to recognize them because representatives from the other two estates started drifting over to them and joining the National Assembly on its terms, namely one man, one vote. So the next question is, what was the Bastille and why was it significant? So the Bastille was an ancient royal prison where all the political prisoners were kept. In the minds of the French, it represented all that was wrong and oppressive about the monarchy. Rumor had it that the king was assembling an army outside Paris that planned to come in and crush the support for the revolution in Paris, and the people stormed the Bastille hoping to find gunpowder with which they could defend themselves and defend the city. The storming of the Bastille made it clear to everyone that the people of Paris, France's biggest, most important, most opinionated city, was not only in support of the revolution, but was also going to force it forward. And if the Bastille, which represented everything bad about the monarchy, was now assailable, as was shown by the storming of the Bastille, then all of the nobility with its hierarchy and its privilege were also assailable. Nobles could make this connection. They, along with lots of clergy, started leaving France in large numbers immediately. And a new Paris city government formed, the Paris Commune. And a new militia formed under the command of Lafayette, the National Guard. And it was tied to the authority of Paris and the National Assembly rather than to that of the king. Then we go to the Great Fear. What was the Great Fear, and what resulted from it? A lot of times we talk about the Great Fear in some kind of an isolation. But complementary to the urban Parisian uprising that brought down the Bastille, there was also a rural peasant uprising that took place all over France. It was fueled by fear of hunger, fear of aristocrats who they thought were going to hoard grain, fear of vagabonds in the countryside who they thought the aristocrats were hiring to steal their grain, fear that the nobles who had left France would come back and exact vengeance. It was fueled by anger at the aristocrats for making them feel this way. And it was fueled by an insistence on having a government that would actually protect them for once instead of protecting the privileged. Their targets were these aristocrats and their houses and their financial records and the things that they had due to their privileges. What were the two August decrees also known as? And by the way, these two decrees happened, one on the 4th and one on the 27th. And the August decrees began as an attempt on the part of the National Assembly, this new legislative body, to somehow take the steam out of these rural peasant uprisings if they could give them some kind of a modest concession to show that they cared about the people. Maybe that would satisfy them and quell the unrest. Well, the first of these August decrees is known as the abolition of feudalism. And the plan was to have a few nobles and clergy get up, renounce some of their hierarchical privileges, and so one got up and did so, and then another, and soon all kinds of nobles were getting up and renouncing things like rights, tithes, dues. Clergy were doing it too, etc. Almost in a sort of competition to give up more privileges than the next guy. And when it was all over, a substantial part of noble privilege in France had been gutted all in one night, and that was on August the 4th, 1789. Then you've got the other decree, which is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And this document outlined 17 natural rights that all men in France were guaranteed. It's an extremely influential document, and it's the first section of the French Constitution, and it even predates our own Bill of Rights in our U.S. Constitution. So what were the October days also known as? Remember, these first two decrees, they were done in August. Now we're kind of jumping ahead a little bit to the October days. What are they also known as? And what was the main issue that caused this event? And what was the result? And so these were also known as the March on Versailles. It consisted mostly of women led by those market wives of Paris known as the fishwives. They were motivated by a serious concern over the price of grain, which they feared was being hoarded, and they were also motivated by the king's foot-dragging regarding an endorsement of those two August decrees. And they marched to Paris on October the 6th, and they got not only a lot of grain for the city of Paris, but they also got the royal family to immediately, the very next day, move to the Tuileries Palace in the middle of Paris, and they even got the National Assembly to move to Paris just a few days later. So that was the October days, also known as the March on Versailles. So next question, how did the structure of the French Constitution differ from that of the U.S. Constitution? Our Constitution begins by describing the structure and the functions of the various branches of the federal government, and it ends with the Bill of Rights, whereas the French Constitution actually begins with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So the list of rights that the French have, that's the first thing on their Constitution. So it's a matter of sequence. It's sequentially different. So what was the civil constitution of the clergy, and what did it demand that priests do? And keep in mind that the National Assembly, it had to address the church if it was going to eliminate privilege and hierarchy. The church was a big part of that entire system. And the National Assembly confiscated a lot of church property and used it to pay off the national debt and to back a new currency. And they closed monasteries, they released monks and nuns from their vows, they reclassified priests as civil servants, which meant that the state now paid their salaries. All civil servants took a standard oath of loyalty to the nation, which meant that priests were now supposed to take the oath of loyalty to the nation as well. And that's when things went a bit crazy. This was extremely controversial and divisive. Some priests took the oath, some did not. A priest who took the oath was called a juror priest or constitutional priest, and one who did not take the oath was called a non-juror priest or a refractory priest. And this controversy over this oath that the priests had to take plagued the revolution for years. Let's move on to the French colonial system. What is Saint-Domingue? Saint-Domingue was France's most profitable colony. It occupied the western half of the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. It supplied France with a huge amount of sugar and other products like coffee and indigo. Sugar is extremely labor-intensive to harvest and process, and Saint-Domingue had about 500,000 slaves living there under horrible conditions. And the possibility of a slave revolt was a constant fear. So, what is this about free people of color? What are free people of color? Saint-Domingue had about 20,000 free people of color living there. Some of these were even slave owners themselves. By the time of the French Revolution, these free people of color had many of their rights stripped away to the benefit of the 25,000 or so whites who were living in the colony. In our lesson, we learned the story of two rich, prominent, free people of color who petitioned the National Assembly, went all the way to France, and petitioned the National Assembly to apply the new Constitution to the colonies and to free people of color in particular. And their petition was actually denied. So that brings us to slavery. Like we said, 500,000 slaves in the colony of Saint-Domingue. Slavery, however, was way more than just on the island of Hispaniola in Saint-Domingue. Slavery was the engine that powered the entire French colonial system. Even colonies that had no slaves existed because of slavery. For example, their colony in India supplied cotton, which was traded for and used to clothe slaves. Women of the Revolution, there were lots of women in the Revolution, Olympe de Gouges and Marie Antoinette and Charlotte Corday, tons of them. So who was this Olympe de Gouges? What did she write? And why was she executed in the coming Reign of Terror? We haven't really studied the Reign of Terror. That happens during the French Republic, and we're really ending this unit at the point where France is just becoming a republic. A little bit about Olympe de Gouges that was kind of going on during this liberal phase before France becomes a republic. Olympe de Gouges was a prolific writer who constantly wrote on women's issues and advocated for women's rights. For example, she wrote a response to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, which was called Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. She was executed by the French Republic during the Reign of Terror, but not for being a proto-feminist. Instead, she was executed because she was accused of being a royalist. She vehemently denied this, said that she was in support of the revolution, but she had written a couple of things that were used against her, and this included a poster called The Three Urns, which some interpreted as advocating a return back to a constitutional monarchy, and the Republic considered that sedition. The political clubs. What were these various political clubs? Remember that political clubs were a very important part of French revolutionary democratic politics. Future political participants of all kinds, from all kinds of viewpoints, cut their teeth on political club activities. And these political clubs spread like wildfire across France. Paris alone, just Paris, had 50 of them. So, what were some of the most important, most prominent, most influential political clubs? And we can begin with the Club Massiac. This club was formed to preserve the institution of slavery in the French colonies by any means necessary. Violence, death threats, whatever it took. For example, we learned the story of a play written by Olympe de Gouges, who we just talked about. And that play was called The Slavery of Blacks, or The Lucky Shipwreck. And the Club Massiac managed to get that play shut down because they didn't like it. Then you have the highly influential, highly relevant Jacobin Club. The Jacobin Club was a bit of a radical left-wing club that began with the name the Society of the Friends of the Constitution. And because they initially rented a space to meet in a Dominican monastery, they acquired the name Jacobins, and the name stuck, and that club grew to 1,500 local societies throughout France, and so it becomes a very large political club, and they became extremely powerful within the Legislative Assembly, and they were pushing for a republic. What about the Monarchions, or the monarchists? They are not in favor of restoring the old regime. They're in favor of the revolution, but they did want to slow the revolution down and reserve a lot of power for the king in the upcoming constitution that they were working on to establish a constitutional monarchy. They also grew throughout France, and they competed with the Jacobin Club for the hearts and the minds of the people. Then we come to the Girondins, and we're going to learn a lot more about them when we explore the French Republic. But to get us started, the Girondins started out as a more moderate faction of the Jacobin Club politically. During the Republic, they actually become quite distinct from the Jacobins. They also became a very powerful faction within the Legislative Assembly and the coming National Convention, which we haven't talked about yet. They were strong advocates for war with Austria for many reasons, which we explored. Their biggest political adversaries, however, were the sans-culottes. Sans-culottes, they're not a political party, but just a little bit of explanation. These were very politically active Paris working people who represented their neighborhoods in the 48 representative sections of the Paris Commune. Just like the United States is divided into 50 states and France is divided into 83 departments, Paris itself was divided into 48 sections. Both the Girondins and the sans-culottes wanted France to become a republic, so they had that in common. But the Girondins wanted to give the new French educational system time to produce a more educated, more virtuous generation of French citizens, in keeping with Rousseau's book, The Social Contract. On the sans-culottes, on the other hand, they didn't want to wait. They wanted France to dethrone its king and convert to a republic as soon as possible. So that was one big difference between the two. And there was another one involving direct democracy that we also explored. The Cordelier Club. What is the Cordelier Club? The Cordelier Club rose in prominence largely due to the king's failed flight from France. Remember that story? Not only did they want a republic, but they campaigned vigorously to get the king removed from the throne. And so the next question, explain the king's flight. What was that all about? Keep in mind that Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette both resented their loss of power, prestige, income. They also felt that they were living under severe restraints, and they may even have felt very strongly that their very lives were in danger. You may remember in that story, the king and his family, they tried to escape from France. They got within 30 miles of the border. Their plan was to get into the Austrian Netherlands and have Marie Antoinette's brother, his forces, her brother was Leopold II, have his forces escort them to safety once they hit the border. Didn't work. They were caught and they were brought back to Paris by the National Guard. And it was extremely disturbing to the people of France that their king would try to leave. So, next question. Whom did France go to war against? And what was this Declaration of Pillnitz all about? France went to war against Austria and Prussia. The Declaration of Pillnitz was a response to the king and queen's arrest and their virtual imprisonment in their palace from where they had tried to escape. And it said that Austria and Prussia would invade France if any harm came to the king or queen. Now, the people who issued this declaration, they thought that this would prevent a war by intimidating the French. Instead, it backfired on them, and it offended the French so much that it made them even more eager to go to war. That brings us to these people called the émigrés. Who are they? The émigrés were a community of mostly aristocrats and clergy who had fled France and were living in exile, mostly in the German town of Koblenz. They wanted the old regime back. They wanted to turn back the clock and have things the way they had been before the revolution started. The Legislative Assembly viewed these émigrés as a grave threat to their existence because these émigrés were seeking allies among the monarchies of Europe to help them return to France and destroy the revolution. So those are the émigrés. Who are the fédérés? The fédérés were a group of about 20,000 National Guardsmen who came to Paris to defend it from attack. These were not fans of the king at all, and they teamed up with the sans-culottes and attacked the king's palace and forced the Legislative Assembly to remove Louis XVI from office and put him in jail. So what was the Brunswick Manifesto? I mean, we've got this Declaration of Pillnitz. What's the Brunswick Manifesto, and what's the difference? The biggest difference between the Declaration of Pillnitz and the Brunswick Manifesto was that by the time of the Brunswick Manifesto, France was officially at war with both Austria and Prussia. So you couldn't threaten to invade because that was already going to happen no matter what. So instead, the Brunswick Manifesto said that if any harm comes to the royal family, that we will harm the civilians in Paris by destroying the city. The Brunswick Manifesto caused a panic in Paris, which actually resulted in the needless massacre of about 1,200 imprisoned people in Paris being held in the various prisons that there are in Paris. But like the Declaration of Pillnitz, the Brunswick Manifesto also backfired on the Austrians and the Prussians, causing the French to become even more determined to win on the battlefield. So this question is a strange one. Who actually overthrew the king? Technically, it was the Legislative Assembly who stripped the king of his powers and his functions, but they were also forced to do it by the fédérés and by the sans-culotte-led 48 sections of the Paris Commune. Next question. What actually happened at the Battle of Val Me? In the Battle of Val Me, the French stared down an attack by the most feared army in Europe, the Prussian army. They refused to run away, and the Prussian commander, the Duke of Brunswick, called the attack off at the last moment and withdrew back out of France. But the Battle of Val Me had much more significance than just a victory by the French over the Prussians. First, it showed that the French citizen was willing to put his life on the line and fight for this revolution. And second, the Battle of Val Me was not a fight between two competing monarchs who had essentially the same ideals and the same values. Instead, the Battle of Val Me was a fight between individual rights and democracy on one side and absolutism and privilege on the other side. And it was fought in front of the whole world. So, how did the French army change as France transitioned into a republic? The Battle of Valmy legitimized and institutionalized a new kind of army, the citizen army. The citizen soldier wasn't just fighting for pay or because he was drafted. Instead, the citizen soldier was a volunteer. And he was fighting with a purpose, and that purpose was to defend a set of values that he believed in. And that made the citizen army dangerous. Even if they lacked training, even if they lacked experience or equipment or supplies, because what they had was something that you couldn't quantify with numbers on paper. They had conviction. They had this thing called élan, which was a fighting spirit. And you couldn't really measure that. So that is all of the questions that will help you do well on this French Revolution test. And I hope you make good use of it, and good luck. Thanks.